Of course, there's a lot to talk about. Let's get right to our panel. Liang is an associate professor and the head of the Willamette University's economics department. She joins us from Portland, Oregon. With us here in Washington, D.C., Saruhan Hatipoglu. He is the CEO of Business Environment Risk Intelligence and a CGTN Global Economic Analyst. James P. Moore is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government, and Society. And John Gong is an economics professor at the University of International Business and Economics in Beijing. And John, it's great to see you. I saw you just about a week or so ago in Beijing. We've got some good news here, at least it looks that way. Both the United States and China saying it's a good start. But we're not hearing a lot about specifics. What's your understanding of this deal, and is this a win-win?
Well, first of all, let me point out that there was an emergency press conference last night at 11 o'clock p.m. in Beijing. This is very, very unusual. I mean, I can't remember the last time that, the government holds an official press conference at that time, 11 o'clock at night. I mean, that testifies to how much importance the Chinese government puts onto this deal. I think it's a great news to the country. It's good for both countries as well. I think what's significant is that at least some of the tariffs are being removed. 120 billion of goods exports from China to the United States. Now it's only 7.5%. Apparently it looks like to me that both sides have been arguing about this enforcement mechanism for some time, and it seems to me that now tariff is being used as a sort of a enforcement mechanism. As we make more progress, there'll be more tariffs reduced. I think also significant is that the press conference says that the second phase negotiation is going to start immediately, and I think that's also very good news, very positive news. That means that as we make progress, some more tariffs will be reduced.
James, let me ask you about this, because I know you hang out with a lot of CEOs, and I know from hearing from a lot of them, many of them frozen. You may have a production line in China. Do we move it to Vietnam? But then if we do move it to Vietnam, what's to say the Trump administration doesn't have tariffs against them? And really the uncertainty of where we go from here. Talk to me about how CEOs are going to view this. Obviously, we don't know a lot of details, but will they view this as good news?
Well, they'll view it as good news because there's at least some progress being shown. This week, for example, I'm a member of the CEO Council of the Wall Street Journal, and we had quite a few major CEOs come to Washington to be able to exchange views, and China was very much the major topic on the table. I think there's concern about not just reducing tariffs. At the end of the day, the goods that flow back and forth between China and the United States can be seen from the rearview mirror. The concern is systemic concerns about how are we going to deal with some of the problems that exist that have nothing to do with simply agreeing to purchase $50 billion worth of agricultural products in the Midwest. And so I think an awful lot of CEOs are trying to figure out what is involved in the rest of this agreement, trying to figure out, is there systemic approaches to the problems that have existed? It's amazing to me that when I was in the U.S. government years ago, and this was in the 1980s. The trade relationship was $4 billion in 1986 to China, $4 billion to the United States. The United States had a $7 million surplus. Well, as of the end of this year, it looks like we're going to be closer to $400 billion of goods we will purchase from China. China will be purchasing about $100 billion from us.
Saruhan, let's talk about that. The president says that we're going to be selling billions, and yet it seemed like Larry Kudlow kind of backed away from that. What do we know about what's going to be trading hands? Because it's still, this is one of the things we see with his administration. You hear one statement from perhaps the president, Mnuchin says something else, Kudlow says something else. It's really tough to determine what actually is on paper.
Yes, we have seen this movie before, but I think this time around there's a little bit more optimism in there. Not about the number, the 50 billion number. Any way you do that math, that number does not add up in 1 year, because they said annually. And then Larry Kudlow came in and said, no, it's actually going to be in 2 years, so which actually makes a little bit of sense. But I was on the phone with a client today, and he said, hey, we could see the chimney at Santa coming down. And to which I replied, the chimney is there, yes, but Santa is stuck in it. So it is not phase one, really, it's phase 0.33. There is, like I said, one good development here is that in the past, we had a stop or break in escalation of tension or tariffs. This time, we have a de-escalation. Some parts of the tariffs actually were reduced, which is a good move. But in terms of looking forward, again, I would never celebrate, and the stock market told us today, the way it acted after the announcement came, I wouldn't celebrate until I see both sides talking points side by side and seeing if actually they match, because we've seen it in the past and they haven't.
We'll give you an opportunity to see that in just a minute or two, but before we do that, I want to ask John Liang a question. According to a free trade advocacy group, American consumers and importers have paid the U.S. Treasury $42 billion in tariffs since the beginning of the trade war with China, and they will continue to pay with the bulk of the tariffs still in place. Has this trade war been worth it?
Well, I think it depends on who you ask. And when it comes to the phase one trade deal, and people were talking about this is a win-win situation, and I think it's interesting that China wins, in the rhetoric that the U.S. is removing the tariffs in exchange for China's, opening and reform that it has already committed to in the first place. But as a matter of fact, if you look at really the numbers, the rollback of the tariffs is really limited. We're still talking about a weighted average tariff rate right around 18 or 19%, even after this truce, which is much higher than the 3% in 2017 before this trade war started. So I think it's a very limited trade deal. It is a good start, but I think there's a lot more to be done, especially coming to the topics about opening the financial sector or intellectual property rights protection. There are a lot more tough negotiations down the road. But then when it comes to the U.S. consumers and firms paying the tariffs, I think that it's one negative aspect of tariffs. But more importantly, I think the impact on consumer sentiment. We have seen 4 months in a row the U.S. consumer confidence is slighted, and the manufacturing production in the U.S. has shrank for 4 months as well. On top of that, you also think about how this unraveled the global supply chain and really undermined business confidence. So I think paying tariffs is one direct cost of this tariff, but there are a lot more negative impacts on both U.S. and China. So a good start, a phase one trade deal is a good start to solving some of those unnecessarily inflicts of pain.
A good start. And John Gong, back to you. Saruhan says he wants to see these statements back to back. You mentioned that news conference. Let's play a little bit of sound from that, and I want to get your reaction on the other side. Let's listen in.
China and the United States have agreed on the text of a Phase 1 economic and trade agreement based on the principle of equality and mutual respect. The text has 9 chapters. The preface, intellectual property rights, technology transfer, food and agricultural products, financial services, exchange rate and transparency, trade expansion, bilateral assessment, and dispute settlement, and the final terms. Both sides reached a consensus that the U.S. side will fulfill its commitments to phase out its additional tariffs on Chinese products so as to achieve a switch from hiking to cutting additional tariffs.
Lots of information there, but the 2 words that really ring true for me, mutual respect. I was just talking to an official in China last week, and they said, we just can't give in to bullying. That seems to be at the heart of this back and forth over this whole period of time. Is that a key component of this, and have we turned the corner in a sense?
Well, I mean, we have to keep in mind that it's Washington who started all this in the first place. So in that sense, I think people in China, a lot of people in China view this as the bullying from the Trump administration, and I think there's some truth to it. But I think as one of your panels said, that at the end of the day, it's the reaching an agreement really counts. We have to come to some kind of conclusion. We have already seen going back and forth and escalation. Now we have to put this thing into effect. Now we have to keep in mind that the Chinese statement has a little paragraph at the end that says it's still subject to a couple of steps. It still has to be subject to translation, for example. That means, in my view, that means a Chinese translation. That hasn't been agreed upon yet by both sides. It also has to be subject to some kind of a legal review by both sides. Now, the Washington statement doesn't say that. And you still have to keep in mind that we haven't signed this thing yet. So I think there's still some uncertainty here, even though it's very little uncertainty, based on the up and downs in the past we have gone through. But hopefully we can go through this time. I don't see much of an issue here. I think, if you look at the information that has already been leaked out or disclosed, I think the concessions made on the Chinese side are actually maybe good. I think overall good for the country in the long run. And the other things, as Liang has said, these are the things that China is going to do anyway. We're planning to do in the future, things like opening up the financial market, issues with respect to intellectual property rights, technology transfer. These are the things that are going to be addressed anyway. So I don't see this as a sort of overly disadvantageous to the Chinese side. I think overall, it's good for both countries, as President Trump said.
Saruhan, you'd asked for back-to-back, so we've heard from an official in China where he talks about the different chapters, 9 chapters, tariff relief, went into specifics. Now let's listen to the U.S. President.
This is a very large deal, the China deal. It covers tremendous manufacturing, farming, a lot of rules, regulations, a lot of things are covered. It's a phase 1 deal, but a lot of big things are covered. The tariffs will largely remain, 25% on $250 billion, and we'll use them for future negotiations on the phase 2 deal, because China would like to see the tariffs off, and we're okay with that, but they'll be used as a negotiating table for the phase 2 deal, which they would like to start immediately, and that's okay with me.
He says a lot of big things, not necessarily as specific with 9 chapters, but give me your sense as you listen to both sides. How do you see things?
Well, yeah, there weren't a lot of specifics there, but we didn't expect a lot of specifics. We just wanted to see the escalation of tension, and that was achieved today. However, looking forward, there are major concerns because the issues that deeply divide the two countries have not been discussed at all. Yes, we're talking about IP issues. Yes, we're talking about forced technology, and they were taken up a little bit with this agreement. There's much more to be discussed about. But look, China, like the previous commentator said, they have to do these things. They have to address these things. China actually is developing patents right now. They do need intellectual property. So they're doing those things. But one thing that was not mentioned in the entire agreement today was the state subsidy issue. And that is the very issue that the China looks at as a national sovereignty issue. And the United States says, you need to cut that. You need to have a different economic model looking forward. You need to be fair. And you're not being fair by favoring the domestic companies. So that part of it makes me very pessimistic about a phase 2 deal. Whether there's going to be a phase 2 at all, forget about just starting discussions on it.
John Gong, I want to get your take on what he just said, because that's where you get into a whole kind of sovereign issue. You can't really push another country into moving in a different direction because you don't like the direction they're going in. Where do we see movement there, or do we?
Well, subsidy indeed has been in existence for some time in China, and it's something that is associated with China's industrial policy. But China is indeed trying to address that. For example, let me give you an example. The Foreign Investor Act that's going to take effect on January 1st, 2020, which is only a few days away, has an explicit provision that says subsidies of any sort would have to be appropriate and not excessive. That means that China is indeed trying to address that issue to some extent. Now, another thing is that subsidy itself is not something totally illegal at the WTO. We have at WTO there is an agreement about subsidies, national state aid and kinds of subsidies that has to be appropriate, and that has to be only related to the technology development part, not in the production part. And that's the overall spirit at WTO's subsidy and agreement. Now, I also want to point out that subsidy is also something that is widely available in the United States as well. Look at the government-sponsored research, for example. You can certainly view this as a subsidy from the government to the private sector. The extensive research and R&D efforts done by DARPA, for example, the National Health Institute, the National Science Foundation, grants to university communities, and all these things are subsidies in a sense, right? I think the difference, or is probably China is much larger in scale. and China's probably going beyond just in the area of product development and R&D area. I think this is an issue we want to address, but you know, I don't necessarily view this as something that is unsurmountable in the Sino-U.S. trade negotiation.
Jim, I want to give you a chance to talk about that because you were in government. Subsidies are a big part of the United States as well. I mean, in fact, many of these farmers have been bailed out because of the tariffs.
Well, there's no question that we could sit for several hours and talk about subsidies and what constitutes a subsidy. But there's also little question that in trying to be able to promote and really connect with those who are trying to sell products overseas, that there have been much more direct subsidies. DARPA, for example, is responsible for the invention of the internet. It's responsible for the creation of drones. But that was very much with a military intent when it was being produced. And yes, it went into the domestic sectors of not only the United States, but countries all around the world. So I wouldn't want to get into the subsidies, but there's no question that a phase one never would have been able to include subsidies. That is a very, very tricky issue. And so what the president was trying to do with President Xi was to make sure that that the issue of tariffs, which was much easier to be able to deal with and deal with intellectual property and financial services, et cetera, was a much easier route to go. I think it's important to put into perspective the fact that in this trade war that we've had, that the United States has enjoyed the most extraordinary, robust economy that we've seen over the past 10 years. And China has been having a less robust economy than what they were enjoying. And so the United States is in a position, particularly looking at the election coming up next year, of trying to deal with some of these things in stages so that effectively it's not going to have a dramatic negative impact going into November of next year.
John Liang, let me ask you the next question because he says it's a robust economy, but I pulled this piece from August, Forbes magazine, the headline reading, amid Trump tariffs, farm bankruptcies and suicides on the rise. The American Farm Bureau Federation publishing a report in July that really dove into farm loan delinquencies and bankruptcies. They found the rates at an all-time high for 6 years and well above the historical average. So the farmers have definitely taken it on the chin, haven't they?
Yes, absolutely. I think I mentioned it earlier that, you know, there's a big wave of family farms bankruptcy. You know, they filed Chapter 12 bankruptcy protection, and that's about 580 farms that have undergone this process. But you know, it's not just the farming sector. I think the tech sector has been suffering because all these you know, bans from selling technological products to China, and also just in general, the U.S. corporations are not doing as rosy as people would like to think. You know, if you look at the corporate debt right now, the corporate debt stood at $15.5 trillion, which is 74% of the GDP. And so if something, you know, that slows down their production, if the consumers are weakening the sort of the confidence and purchases, this could be you know, very negative for the U.S. Economy, even though we're talking about, you know, job growth. But again, you know, the pay growth has been really moderate, 3% so far. So I think, you know, even though the U.S. economy is growing, you know, in a robust way, I think there are still weak areas to be really careful. And also, you know, the time is important because, you know, as president heading into 2020 election, he needs to make sure that the economy is doing very well. Going back to the state subsidies question, I just want to quickly point out, I think, you know, there are ways for China to be smart and streamline its subsidies. You know, maybe continue subsidizing industries to access capacity, like, you know, solar panels or steel productions, does make sense for China. But, you know, China can definitely, the government can definitely support, you know, basic research and development. And the very recent example is the Ministry of Finance, along with other state companies, have set up funds to, you know, raise capital to support some of the high-tech development. So I think there are ways for China to be able to streamline subsidies and yet still support its technological development.
Saruhan, the president we heard in that soundbite still wants to use tariffs in his toolbox again if he needs to. Have they been an effective tool? Because, I mean, in some sense, couldn't we have gotten to this deal a lot sooner?
Well, Two separate questions, I think. They have been effective because it has brought revenue to the government. Now, it's not coming from China. It is coming from American companies, but it has brought revenue to the government. And I want to just mention also the economic part of the equation, where we said the economy, and I understand that corporations are not as strong now in the U.S. as a decade ago when they were getting stronger after the financial crisis with the incentives that have been provided. But the U.S. economy is very well diversified. If the business investment is not working, the consumption is. And I think with this president, I personally criticize him quite a bit, but he was able to balance that quite well in that the U.S. economy is still the best in the world right now. The reason that we had this agreement was because the president also knows that consumption was the first pillar to go if the tariffs went, and that would be the end of this economic boom right before the election. So in my opinion, again, looking forward, the economy is going to be a factor, and enforcement is going to be a factor. And once you apply tariffs, whether we agree with it or not, once they're applied, they should not be taken off completely if you still haven't achieved what you're supposed to achieve as the negotiating party. So tariff threat is going to be there, and to a certain extent, it should be there. Once they're, like I said, introduced, you just can't take it back until you reach your goal in the negotiations.
John Gong, there's been so much talk in the last couple of years about decoupling, and we know that these two economies are very much intertwined. When you looked at the Obama administration, they really had kind of a two-prong approach: competition and cooperation, where there was areas where they could cooperate with China. It seems as though the Trump administration has been more chaos and confrontation. As we look to the new year, do you think that that might change, or are we still in for some bumpy roads ahead?
I think the decoupling the Trump administration is talking about, is actually doing, is at the technology level. We call it technology decoupling, and it's already happening. It's already happening on a large scale. For example, Chinese investment in the startup companies in Silicon Valley is almost drying up. And it's also very difficult these days for Chinese companies to acquire American companies, to going through what's called a CFIUS process. And the Trump administration is also creating difficulties for Chinese students to go to the United States to study STEM-related subjects at graduate level. All these things are happening right now at a aim of trying to basically decouple at a technology level. The problem is this kind of a technology decoupling is inevitably going to spread into other areas, into economic and trade areas. And that's very sad in my opinion. China-U.S., as you said, the two economies are intimately intertwined. And I think with this technology decoupling trend, this intertwinedness is inevitably going to be affected. Corporate America is going to be very hesitant, in my opinion, to keep investing in China. So that's going to create a problem. I'm very concerned about that prospect, actually.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Hey, Yan Liang, quickly, if you can, one final question. There's another issue that's come up. Of course, that's the appellate body of the World Trade Organization in the United States, not appointing judges to this panel. It's kind of hit a roadblock. They say that they're going beyond their mandate. Where does that go?
Well, it's clear that the U.S.'s intention is to paralyze the WTO as a major trade negotiation platform, and also trade disputes platform. And that is very peculiar because, after all, the U.S. has been accounting for more than 20% of the WTO cases that, that the U.S. also won 90% of the chance when they brought complaints to the WTO. So one would wonder why the U.S. is trying to destroy the sort of WTO at its own peril. I think the reason is, the U.S. is thinking that by power play and negotiation at the bilateral level, it will be able to get better deals. But for the WTO right now, it would take years for them to fix this dispute appeal mechanism. But there are still dispute panels going on, 33 dispute panels right now. So it is still working, but definitely not work as effectively as it used to be. Well, and then the final question that I just want to quickly add is about this sort of decoupling in tech. I think it's concerning that on the one hand, we have softening in this trade tension, but on the other hand, we see the escalation of tech tension, and I share the concern with John.
I'm going to have to stop you there. Thank you so much. I want to thank all our panel. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Wolf from Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.